And welcome to the President's Panel. APRA leaders reflect on the past and plan for the future. I'm your moderator today, Sharice Harrison. I'm very excited about this panel today because I really want to hear from our leaders about what's going on with APRA. The past year and a half has been crazy to say the least, and APRA has such a huge impact on just how I do my job and how I interact with the industry. So I really want to talk to our leaders about what do they see our plan for the future. So I will start off by asking our panelists to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about why they decided to serve on the board. And I'll start with the current APRA president, Misa.
Hi, I'm Misa Lobato. I'm the Director of Prospect Management and Analytics at the Rhode Island School of Design, and I'm APRA's current president. I started my service to APRA in my chapter, which at the time was CPRA and now is APRA Rocky Mountains. But I started that service and then moved into my board service because I felt really indebted to the APRA community. I had started prospect development work at a time where we didn't have professional development budget, and APRA community members, my network in APRA really taught me everything I know about prospect development. So I just felt very strongly about supporting the community.
Great, well, I'll go next. I'm Melissa Banks-Stepnow, and I'm APRA's incoming president. And I serve as Director of Analytics and Business Consulting Services at Blackbaud. And like Misa, I started my volunteer service at my chapter level at NEDRA, and I served on the NEDRA board for a couple of years. And then I had to step away just because of work commitments at the time. But I realized that as my career continued to take a non-traditional path and transition over the years, APRA was a constant throughout my entire career. And I always really appreciated the passion of the community and the common spirit of inquisitiveness amongst all of us. So in 2017, someone encouraged me to put my hat in for board role, and I thought about it and I thought, yes, this is the perfect next step for me. So I went ahead and enjoyed my ride ever since. And here I am ready to serve all of you as president next year.
And I am Bon Lammy. I'm immediate past president of APRA. And it has been a great pleasure to serve on this board for as many years as I have. Just like Misa and Melissa, I guess I should say my role in my day job, I am Senior Vice President of Philanthropic Counsel at BWF. We're a campaign consulting company. And just like Misa and Melissa, my entry point into the APRA community as a volunteer was with my local chapter at the time, APRA Illinois. And I was working at a one-person shop at the time, and we had just spun off our own development program. We're a academic medical center that was affiliated with a university. And quite honestly, I just didn't know if I was doing the right stuff. I had no idea. I found a lot of really great resources and guidance, but getting involved with my local APRA chapter was my lifeline to learning different tools and resources. I think that it is more valuable to serve as a volunteer in terms of the skill sets that I've learned than attending any conference session. Having said that, this is a great conference. In terms of why I then decided to make the jump to the board, similar to what Melissa said, my career in the consulting space was kind of on a different trajectory than other folks. And being on the board was an opportunity to flex in a leadership position within the industry without a formal prospect development team that I was working with, like at a typical university or hospital or what have you. So it was an opportunity to play a leadership role and really see where the industry was going. And that was really exciting to me. And having said that, I think, again, there's that thread of I've learned so much more being actively engaged as a volunteer than I ever thought I would. It's kind of a more than meets the eye type scenario.
Thank you all. And I will say, as a member of APRA since 2008, I've sat on my fair share of committees. So what has been the most surprising to you about serving on the APRA board, and how is it different than serving on a committee?
I'll start. I had served and chaired some committees. I chaired a conference, the 2015 conference in New Orleans, and I had chaired other committees, and I had been the president of my chapter. And so I kind of came into my board service with the sort of perspective on, you know, the service to the membership and the educational mission of APRA. And I was thinking in a very sort of operational headspace, just, you know, how the decisions we make on our educational events and the focus of those events, or, you know, thinking about kind of planning how that we would be sort of planning out the year and focusing on sort of the tactical, operational, executional side of running the organization. And there's an aspect of that. There is definitely an aspect of you know, of annual planning and execution. But what was most surprising to me was just really seeing the ways in which APRA was positioned and could be further positioned to really influence the entire philanthropic industry, and you know, our ability to be like strategic leaders in the industry and provide kind of maybe a different lens on how to address some of like the urgent issues in nonprofit organizations or in philanthropy, and so, you know, that was very surprising to me. Another thing that was very surprising to me was just the function of the operation and the way in which we work with a, you know, a paid staff through an association management company, and how that staff operates, the extent to which they provide services throughout our entire organization. So I think having worked in a leadership role in a chapter, I was really thinking that we were going to be really involved in sort of management and operations, and I wasn't as prepared for how much of our focus would be spent on kind of the strategic visioning for the entire industry.
Yeah, I want to pick up on Misa's thread because my experience was fairly similar. And it's funny because the board has to remind ourselves sometimes that our role is to be more strategic, and that we have not only an incredibly strong professional staff to help with a lot of the tactical and operational things, but also we have an incredibly strong volunteer network. And therefore, it kind of frees us up to have that strategic focus. And it was an adjustment because I was so used to being in the weeds, and I like being in the weeds, but that's not our role here. You know, when I served on the NEDRA board, we thought we had a strong volunteer base, and we did for the size and scale that the NEDRA community is, and we were successful in growing it through my time on the board, and I'm assuming that NEDRA is still successful in growing its volunteer base. But as a board, we still did a lot of the work of the committees. So typically the board members served as the de facto chair of the committee and did the work to get the job done, and then had a couple of volunteers to help them along the way. Whereas on the APRA board, the board members serve as board liaisons and advisors, but we have a volunteer chair that's really there to steer the ship of that specific committee. Same thing when I was on the AFP Northern New England board. There it was actually interesting because your offer to volunteer was often what ultimately led you to be on the board. I moved to New Hampshire. I volunteered for one committee 1 year, and the next year I was asked to join the board. And I think for them, it was more because they didn't have that robust volunteer base, that they were just looking for anyone willing to put time into the effort. And I don't think one's better or worse. I think it's just different, and it's a lot about size and scale. I kind of liken it to our professional world. If you're a single person researcher, you probably got your hands on a lot of different things. You might be doing gift entry, you might be doing prospect management. You work for a very large university or hospital shop, you are a dedicated researcher, separate from the front line, separate from the gift entry, separate from all of the other functions. And it's kind of the same thing here, where our focus is to be separate from those tactics and to think about how we advance the entire profession through advocacy and partnership on a broader scale than we would be able to do if we were focused on the tactics.
And I'll just build on what both, again, what both Misa and Melissa said. You know, we are an industry that really loves benchmarking and best practices. And having an association management company like Smith Buckland, who is APRA's partner from a paid professional perspective, be able to provide that feedback and that context has been invaluable. Sometimes it's a bit of you know, much like how when you meet somebody at a conference and you're talking shop and you want to make sure that your terms mean the same things as their terms. Sometimes there's a lot of back and forth, making sure that we understand from our expertise what the association perspective is. There's some things that are really different between those two worlds, and there's some things that are very similar. But it's been really great to have that resource from the perspective of what are the new trends in new technology or tools being used to facilitate conferences, having conversations about accessibility of spaces and closed captioning and things like that, having conversations about membership models and looking at different perspectives there. And then the fiduciary component, which, you know, at any level, if you're involved as a volunteer on a board or a leadership committee, you've certainly encountered that. But being you know, all three of us actually served as treasurer of APRA prior to becoming president, which isn't always the case. But it gives you such a solid foundation. And to be honest, you feel a bit of the weight. I definitely felt the financial burden of the organization and took it really seriously in that year and all the years after, in terms of reading our statements and making sure that we as a board and the treasurer specifically are really focused on the financial health and well-being and longevity of APRA as an association. And certainly from a chapter treasurer perspective, which I also was, that is a concern. But it just feels amplified because it's for all APRA membership. And then I think the other component that surprised me a bit, or that I think is a real benefit to APRA, is the amount of kind of rotation, right? Every 3 years, every year people are cycling in and cycling out with these 3-year terms. And so you always have to do a bit of onboarding and bringing people up to speed on where things are. And you also benefit from these great ideas and fresh new perspectives. And it's such an asset to APRA to have that constant influx of folks, so that we're not stuck in kind of this, we've always done it this way mentality.
Thank you. It sounds like there is a lot on the leadership shoulders based on your descriptions. So not only do you have to be kind of in the weeds a bit, but also very strategic, forward-looking, but also keep the lights on. So let's go back to 2019. What was the vision for APRA at that time?
Well, I will start with this one. We were, our current strategic plan started in 2019. So it's a 2019 to 2021 strategic plan. And, you know, we all know 2019, we were carefree and we were hugging and we were licking doorknobs and all sorts of things. Okay, maybe not that last one. So in our in-person board meeting in 2019, we had a facilitated workshop as a board where we really worked through laying the groundwork for what our strategic planning process was going to look like. I guess this would have been the end of 2018. And we mapped out, where do we want to be? What do we want to do? And it was really a point of I don't want to say crossroads, because certainly boards prior to that iteration had these conversations, but we thought, we don't want to just maintain the status quo. We want to think big about where APRA could go and what all the possibilities are. And really our philosophy since then has been built off of that model that we set in that strategic plan. And we came up with this phrase, BondCo, which is part of this, like just laying out different words of like where we wanted to go and the vision of APRA. And I promised that it was entirely circumstantial that it happened. It was either co-bond or BondCo. Those were the options for the letters that we came up with. But the words are bold, opportunistic, nimble, decisive, creative, and open-minded. So we have tried, ever since we put that in place as a board, we have tried to operate from that mentality for any decision that we make, are we keeping in mind those core tenets as central to the decision-making process? Now, we certainly have to align that, Sharice, with what you just said, with making sure we keep the lights on. So, recent events have modified the trajectory a bit, but in particular, that idea of being forward-thinking and really bold and thinking about ways that we can diversify opportunities and offerings for our membership beyond just the traditional conference and membership model.
It's interesting though, because one of the things that I think we realized when we were going through this BondCo exercise, and Bond's right, it's not because her name is Bond. We really did spend an entire dinner chit-chatting and trying to create a word with the words that Bond just said. That if we were really going to embrace this BondCo mentality, that it would cost us money and that we'd have to put funds behind it, or we weren't going to be successful. We would just stay in status quo, that we would need to invest. And historically, the APRA board has been incredibly fiscally conservative. We still are. And I think that's actually a really good thing, because even as we're rotating people in and out, we've all, I think, over the years maintained that conservative mindset, which has kept us healthy. And it's part of the reasons why, frankly, we've had the reserves to help us weather through what's been happening over the past 18 months. And Bond's right, because I was treasurer from that year 19 to 20, so the beginning of COVID. And you do feel like the weight is on your shoulders when you know that the association's finances are not your responsibility in total, but you are the overseer of it, right? So anyway, we knew that we had to put money behind this BondCo concept. And luckily, we were coming off of a year where we had a surplus coming out of 2019. So we voted to earmark a portion of our 2019 surplus for something that we called the Innovation Fund. And it was basically the idea that we wanted to earmark money that would be available for us to invest in this new growth and bold and opportunistic mindset. And the reality is we would have had the money anyway, right? Because the money would have just been sitting in our reserves and like our savings account. But we had the foresight to say, if we earmark it for this purpose, then when the right opportunity presents itself, we don't have to worry about dipping into our overall savings. We know that we've got this money set aside for something, and we wouldn't have to hem and haw and go through that whole process of like worrying about whether or not we were going to have a blocker to actually get anything done. So it really gave us the permission that we needed to push ourselves and to push our committees to come up with ideas and bring them back to the board to say, here's what we really think could make a really big difference.
Thank you. So in 2019, we were BondCoing, we were being innovative, we were rolling in the dough, and along comes 2020. How did those challenges in that year impact APRA?
Well, maybe I'll just pick up where I left off with my last answer, because the Innovation Fund, timing is everything sometimes. So just to set the context a little bit for everyone who's listening in, historically, the board's held in-person board meetings 3 times a year: in February, over the summer in conjunction with Prospect Development Conference, and in November. So just as we are all virtual for this conference, the board is virtual as well. We have not met in person since February of 2020 because of COVID and budget restrictions. In February 2020, Sharice, you're right, we were full steam ahead. We had this inkling that was something happening in the world called COVID, but we still gathered in person. We still had a big networking opportunity with an APRA fundamentals cohort and with a chapter leadership summit that was coinciding with our board meetings. There were hugs, there were handshakes. I don't think there were any licking of doorknobs happening, but you can imagine it was the old world. So we're full steam ahead, we're embracing BondCo, and at that February board meeting, we actually funded a new learning management system, or an LMS platform, that we just launched recently, but it was funded at the February 2020 board meeting. And if you think about it, hindsight is 2020, no pun intended to the year 2020, but that was one of the most opportunistic decisions we could have ever made, and we didn't even know it, because we voted to fund that investment, understanding that it was for the good of APRA's future. Distance learning was for the good of APRA's future, for APRA's growth, for our members' betterment, but we didn't know how important distance learning and remote learning would become just a month later when the world started shutting down. And I don't believe that as a board we ever would have pivoted quickly enough to make that investment had it not been for the fact that we had the innovation fund set aside and we had not already embraced this BondCo mindset. So this spring was incredibly tenuous, especially sitting where I was as treasurer and knowing that we were heading into what was supposed to be an in-person prospect development conference. And we tried to make quick decisions with limited information, as we all did in our professional and personal lives. And you all know that we shifted PD 2020 and 2021 to be remote. But I think that LMS piece was just so pivotal for us. And now all of us, all of the members are going to be able to benefit from it from the long term as we figure out what a new normal looks like.
Yeah. I'm building on what Melissa is saying. I'm also thinking another thing that was really fortuitous at that same board meeting was that we had been talking in the executive committee about the way in which we wanted to sort of position our expertise with some of our industry partners, AFP, CASE, AASP, just some of our peer associations that we were interacting with. We were trying to sort of think about what was the sort of platform we wanted to support kind of what APRA brings to the table. And we had come up with three areas in which we felt like we had they were industry hot topics. They were things that were coming up really regularly in industry publications. You would see this on other associations conferences as topics, and they were three areas that we felt like we can bring something really important to the table here. And those were data-driven decision-making, which is, of course, everything that we do. Also ethics and due diligence. There was kind of an increased amount of focus on due diligence and on, this was at the time where there were conversations about Sackler. There were conversations about, I think it was the Met board and the influence of wealth and also, how people were sort of bringing their own political perspectives to nonprofit organizations or to universities and impacting their functioning. So the ethics and due diligence piece was a really hot topic. And then the other thing was diversity, equity, inclusion. We had already put diversity and inclusion in our strategic plan, and we had written a diversity and inclusion statement of principles and had founded a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. So we were already really invested in it, but we also believed that our members were in a unique position to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in nonprofit organizations. They were familiar with how to identify prospects. They knew they could provide information to frontline fundraisers on cultural practices and on the philanthropic priorities of communities that had been less engaged with kind of the traditional nonprofit structure, which has tended to be a very white space. And so we felt really strongly that this was an area that we could promote our thought leaders and really impact the industry. So we had identified those three areas, and we were already thinking about thought leadership in the areas and how also our educational offerings and our educational resources aligned with those areas and could help our members position their expertise. And then, what happened after we had moved into, the COVID lockdown space was there was the murder of George Floyd. There was the murder of Breonna Taylor. So we were already really engaged in DEI work, but suddenly this was an even bigger conversation, and organizations, all sorts of organizations, for-profit, nonprofit, were suddenly trying to, talk about how they were doing anti-racist work and how they were committed to social justice. And so because we already had the committee functioning, we were able to put just a lot of effort and energy behind our work there. And then, kind of coming into the transition between bonds, the end of bonds year and the start of my year, and DEI being like a very strong passion area of mine. We just really put a lot of effort and energy into that in 2020. So, those were, I think we sort of fortuitously had already come up with these 3 areas of expertise. And then when we were getting into a place where our members were being furloughed or laid off, we were able to kind of pivot that to be, an advocacy platform. So why people working in prospect development are incredibly important in nonprofit organizations to sort of meeting these challenges.
And I'll just add to that. I think that together we're kind of painting this narrative of that we did what you hope with any strategic plan is lay the groundwork and then continue to come back to that, so that at the point that the system might get stressed, or at the point where there's moments of opportunities, in both instances, you can react and respond, not based off of kind of a gut feel of where you are in the moment, but based off of that framework that you've set in place. So that strategic plan had been in place for years, and actually thinking back to what led us to the LMS initially was the decision to start Plugin as a virtual conference experience several years prior. That was a decision we had, I think, in the 2017-2018 board tenure. So you take that framework of having that kind of being nimble and opportunistic and decisive, and then you lay these 3 core areas that Misa articulated of areas where APRA had a value proposition that we felt was unique in the industry. And then we were able to approach some of these institutional partners and do a panel last year at APRA with leaders of AHP, AASP, and of AFP. And we were able to have conversations about all 3 of those topics with that particular panel and see how it's relevant in our industry. And then tying it back to kind of advocacy and opportunities for the members. We had a serious conversation about, we launched the LMS and we approved the LMS from the Innovation Fund. And we had approved some of the additional Innovation Fund money to continue to help launch the LMS. Were we making the right decision because of where things were financially? And ultimately, we were able to use that same decision-making platform of, does this contribute strategically to where we need to go as an association? Are we being bold? Are we being decisive? Are we being nimble? Or is this serving as something where we're being conservative in our choices just because we're fearful almost? And we were really able to use that as a framework. If something was in alignment with those 3 areas that we knew were the value proposition of APRA, and they were in alignment with our strategic plan, yes, we were moving forward with them. If they didn't meet that criteria, it was pretty simple. So it's, as president and in that handoff at that time to Misa, those were the conversations we had of, what is the true value proposition of APRA? How can we provide the most value to our members? And we had gotten feedback from a member at that point, probably a number of members, but feedback at that point in time of, can we provide financial assistance to individuals because professional development budgets have been cut? And that's led to the APRA Foundation a few months ago being able to award out those first professional development grants. And so, the interests and the needs of the community in bringing that information to us and those ideas, knowing where our chapters are struggling, where our members are struggling, and being able to be responsive yeah, we may not be able to turn something on in 3 weeks, but we are, I think, much better situated now when some sort of concern or need does arise to be able to be responsive to it and to be able to enact something as a result.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that it was a really hard year to go through. It was hard for Bond. It was hard for me. You know, we were in this position of having a significant budget shortfall, which is just, as Melissa said, not something that had really been the case for APRA for a while. And certainly in my board tenure, we just really didn't have a lot of experience with, you know, having to make decisions that would affect us financially really substantially mid-year. And so, so that aspect of it was really hard. But we were able to kind of really focus in on what really serves our members, what serves their security in their roles, and then, you know, and what serves their educational needs. I mean, in addition to sort of the LMS being a great platform for online education, like, you know, APRA Fundamentals, we also had started putting work into a data science course. And that data science course, which will launch soon, would really also give us like great positioning within the industry as the sort of the thought leaders in data science in fundraising. And so, you know, we were really able to kind of focus in on what was really going to serve our members, and also what was really going to move us forward and continue to put us in a position of influence within the industry. And I think that, you know, when we were going through the process of making decisions about, you know, do we continue to fund the LMS? Do we continue to fund things that we had already been planning for, you know, when suddenly we were in a different financial position than we were expecting? As Bond said, you know, in some ways it really clarified our thinking about the future of our organization, and helped us sort of maybe get a little bit out of the you know, this is the way that things have been. Even more, it helped us get a little bit more toward the place of, you know, we see where we want to be, you know, in the future, and we need to move decisively in that direction, in this new resource constricted, you know, complex layoff, nonprofits not raising money, just the environment that we were living in. You know, we had to be much more focused.
Thank you. Well, it sounds like we've been through a lot, and there were a lot of really hard decisions that had to be made. And I think it's a huge testament to not only the APRA leadership, but APRA volunteers and also Smith Buckland. Last year, I was on the curriculum planning committee. So we had to pivot to virtual experience, not thinking that this was a thing, you know, in February. So I definitely feel you and understand all the things that happened last year, which really caused a shift for not only APRA and other organizations, but for the world. So based on that, what we've experienced, you know, over the past year, where do we go from here?
I think we're kind of, you know, moving in the same direction that we had the path that we had set forward in 2019 for our 2019-2021 strategic plan. So I think a lot of the same things are very relevant. I think we still have a need for advocacy. I think we still have a need to demonstrate the strategic value of prospect development and to create better understanding within the industry of what prospect development is and how it serves organizations. I think that with that, the advocacy platform that I talked about, the sort of the 3 focus areas, I think will continue to be things that we will be really focused on, both in providing education to our members and in thinking about our strategic planning for our next strategic plan, which that strategic planning will start next year. So I think a lot of the directionally, we're still kind of headed in the same area, but I think there have been some things that have happened since then that we have started to feel really strongly, even more strongly about making philanthropy a bigger part and a better agent in the social justice movement, and really also asking our members to be change agents in their organization around diversity, equity, inclusion, around donor diversification, around cultural competency with philanthropic communities that had been in many ways largely excluded from the kind of traditional nonprofit structure. So I think we'll have a lot of focus there. I think that there are things from our past strategic plan that we had to deaccelerate on that we will move back into focus and thinking about within now sort of the different landscape that we're living in, how do things like credentialing serve our members, and is that something that we feel strongly about as providing that would provide a great benefit to our members. So I think in many ways we're still headed in the same direction. It's just maybe with a different sense of urgency around some of the things that we had already talked about and we'd already put in our strategic plan.
On the one hand, it sounds trite to say we're still heading on the same path after everything that has happened, but I totally agree. I think the board is still very much committed to that concept of BondCo, and we have to balance being conservative, which we don't want to be too conservative because that goes against the BondCo concept, but being somewhat conservative because we don't know exactly what the new normal is going to look like yet. We're still figuring it out, but I think we weathered through the worst of the storm. We've talked a lot today about how our strategic plan is coming to an end this year, and typically we would start the strategic planning conversation at our summer board meeting, which typically would be right now. We'll be having our summer board meetings in August this year virtually. But we also realize that as well as so many things have pivoted to a virtual world, strategic planning is so important that we think it will be better if we could do it in person. And we're hoping that we'll be able to meet together in person at least once next year. So we're actually considering shifting the strategic planning conversations to the beginning of 2022 instead of the summer of 2021 to give us more time to readjust and let the world kind of settle back in. Because we feel so strongly about those core values that Misa's talked about a few times, and we know what our North Star is. I think we've acknowledged that we don't need a strategic plan immediately on January 1st to continue our work. So it's just one example of how I think we've allowed ourselves a little bit more flexibility to adjust while moving forward at the same time. And I actually think because of the way we frame those 3 areas, DEI work, data-driven decision-making, ethics, and compliance, APRA's future is really, really bright. We have an incredibly strong board, pats on all of our backs. We have very passionate volunteers, pats on Sharice's back. We've got very loyal members. We know that because even with everything that's going on, our membership numbers are still holding pretty steady. So our day jobs, our roles, our personas are becoming more and more the center of the modern philanthropic office. And I think the combination of all of that positions us really well to lean into what the new normal is going to be and continue to think about how we scale and how we evolve as the industry evolves. This is so dorky of me, but as I was thinking about this panel, I actually pulled up my board nomination statement from 2017. If you don't know, when you apply or you're nominated for the board, you are asked to fill out a nomination statement. And one of the things on there talked about what the nominee, what I thought the vision for the profession was. And when I was reading it back this morning, I talked a little bit about how APRA has evolved over its 30+ year history. You know, when prospect research started, well, not started, but when APRA started 30+ years ago, the internet didn't even exist. And think about all that we had to do to pivot our industry, our association, our work skills, our work daily life, just because of the internet. And I think we're at one of those inflection points right now where we're kind of going through the same thing. It's not the internet, but there's something big that's about to happen, and we're going to weather through it, and we're going to come out even stronger on the other side. And that's what I'm focused on, even if we know that it's going to take us a little bit longer to figure out the specifics of how and what.
Amazing. It sounds like we have just such a firm foundation for APRA, and that everyone in the years has been able to build upon it, and we have an exceptionally bright future. And to wrap up our final question, how has your time on the APRA board impacted your leadership style back at your own organization?
I guess I can start there. This year with APRA has been such a very interesting leadership experience. I've been serving in a leadership capacity for a while, 12 years. And I had been serving even at an executive leadership capacity, and had to make really hard decisions around layoffs, around salaries, around budgets. But I feel like one thing that really became clear to me over the past year was that I stopped wanting my work to be just about making my organization really efficient and data driven in their operations. Like that, of course there's an aspect of that, but my leadership in APRA expanded my thinking in terms of, what do I really believe that philanthropy can do in the world, and how can I get philanthropy to be engaging in the world in a way that feels more meaningful to me. Even I would say it was before COVID. It was still when we were in person. I had read this article, it was in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and it was called Higher Ed's Dirty Money Problem. And it was talking about philanthropy and about wealth and the influence of wealth in higher education. And it really just blew up my brain a little bit, because I had to really think about, what are some of the things that I'm doing that have actually been contributing to the influence of wealth in my organization, and also to the ability of wealthy people to whitewash their names using philanthropy, or to influence things that they would not necessarily have access to if philanthropy didn't exist. And it just made me want philanthropy to be different and better. And I think this year in APRA has really made me feel like that's possible. There are things that we can do that can really truly impact philanthropy. And one of the things that I'm really proud of from my board year, my year as president, it's been more than 1 year. But even this present year has felt like more than 1 year. But one thing that I'm really proud of is the Ethics and Compliance Committee had developed this DEI identity data guide, and the purpose of that guide is to help people in prospect development lead conversations and lead the sort of the practices around the ethical collection, storage, and use of identity data, and really founded in the belief that you have to understand the identity of your constituents if you want to meaningfully impact your organization's diversification efforts in many ways, diversification of prospect portfolios, diversification of boards, of advisory boards, of events, and also to sort of help people become more comfortable talking about identity, and how sort of talking about identity and talking about racism and systems of oppression shouldn't be this topic that we all avoid, this thing that we all believe that we should try to pretend doesn't exist, because that doesn't serve our efforts in anti-racism. And so I am really proud of that guide, and I really believe that that the use of that guide by our members can truly impact the entire profession, can truly impact all of philanthropy. And so I think my biggest thing in the board now is that my sights are raised. It isn't just about being really great within my organization, or even being even thought of within the larger industry as being a solid practitioner, but really thinking about creating the type of philanthropy that I can believe in and feel like I want to be a participant in.
I'll go next. Misa was very big picture. I might bring this back to kind of three things that feel really relevant to me and my experience on the board, and my experience in my day job. First, I'll address the elephant in the Zoom, as it were, which is that 2/3 of this panel of presidents and past presidents are in consulting vendor spaces, myself and Melissa. And ever since I joined the board 7-ish years ago, that has been something that has been constantly on my mind, and something that I've been aware of and tried to navigate as best as possible in terms of being clear when I'm wearing which hat. And for me, that has felt very ethically important. One, because our profession is centered around ethics. And two, I'm a prospect development practitioner first and foremost. And it is a challenging rope to walk. And it has been one that I've just tried to be as clear as possible in my day job, that these two components certainly are very related and intertwined, but there's places that things need to be really, really clear. I've recused myself from conversations at board meetings that were not appropriate for me to be a part of. And I've recused myself from conversations at my company that didn't seem appropriate given my role and the knowledge I had of certain information. That is a very specific answer that is not going to apply to a lot of this audience. But I do think that it's something that our membership is concerned about. And I'm aware of the fact that other associations have different perspectives. And even APRA, up until I believe when Michael Quevely was president, up until then, vendors and consultants were allowed to be on the APRA board, but not be on the executive committee. So this has been an evolution for APRA, and I recognize that it's something that is not a comfort zone for everyone. So really appreciate all of the positive encouragement and help that I've had from folks, including Michael Quevely, along the way about how to navigate that role. So Melissa, I'm here if you need some help.
Ditto everything Bon just said.
So the next one would be being bold. I am not concerned with making sure that as in my time as president that my perspective was known, but also making sure that there was room for other people to voice their perspectives. And I've really tried to take that back in my conversations with my colleagues and with clients. And it's hard to do, and I'm sure that I have not done it successfully. But it's important to remember that you're a leader for a reason, and that reason is not to manage a clock. That reason is not to make sure that the agenda happens on time. It's to make sure that all the voices in the room are able to be heard and that we're able to come to some level of consensus, or if we're not, we know why we're not able to come to consensus and we can move forward. And so I've tried to continue to pick that up and balance it in my day job. And then finally, and this will sound a little counter to what I just said, APRA adopted a way of making sure that in meeting agendas, we say, this is just an open discussion, or you know what, we already decided this is just an update for y'all, versus saying, we need to make a decision on this particular topic. And then we started organizing our agendas. So the stuff we needed to make a decision on, one, we had all the information we needed ahead of time, and two, we could make a decision. And had the time we needed for that decision. And I was surprised when I started as president, how much time I spent looking at agendas and reordering things. And like, Misa's nodding, Melissa will be nodding. It's wild. It is so weird, but it is important to step back and say, okay, why are we actually here? What's the conversation we need to have? Because if you just put a topic in front of a bunch of people who are decision makers in an area, we're going to start discussing it ad nauseum. And we already made that decision. We've actually had that happen a few times on the board. So that's been really important to take back to my organization and my work with my clients. And actually, I'm doing a session later on today with my colleague Jackie from Missouri State on how to kind of structure meetings to be more useful and purposeful for your organization. So shameless plug for that. It's a boring topic, but it's really important. And I think 90% of the effectiveness of a conversation with a group of people, also known as a meeting, is on the pre-work that goes into that and making sure that we have the objectives clear going in. So again, sounds super simple, but that's been a huge takeaway from my experience on the board.
I guess I got to get my reordering skills up and going. But I think Bon's right in that the way in which our meetings have been architected have evolved quite substantially over time. And that's something that I can bring back to my day job and think more strategically about the purpose of a meeting and why we're having a meeting. But to take this in a slightly different direction, I think I want to talk about balance a little bit, because what I've learned is that there's a lot of different ways that I can think about balance that being on the APRA board has really helped me with. The first one is a little bit strange because I actually don't, in my day job, work with a lot of nonprofit clients anymore. My position has evolved. If you stripped away the industry that I'm passionate about and why I'm doing my work, I'm a business person. I work for a large corporation in a management role. And if you just generically stripped everything away, that makes me a business leader. That is not what I'm passionate about. I would never seek to do my job at fill in some other software company or some other industry company that's a for-profit company, right? I'm a prospect researcher first, but my career has taken me in such a way that I don't day-to-day work with customers like I used to when I was a consultant, and I miss that. So APRA provides me with that touch point and a continuing way to stay directly invested on a day-to-day level with what I really think of as my true career path, prospect research, prospect development. But there's a balance to that too, because it has occurred to me occasionally in board conversations that being able to bring the pure business perspective that I've learned because of the path that I've happened to take in my career back to the board in terms of considerations that we have in board meetings and how we make decisions, I believe, and Bond and Misa could call me out here or privately correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that that business perspective has helped APRA as well. And that's an interesting balance that I think has helped me in both places. The other place that I've noticed balance has really played a role, Bon gave a call out to Michael Quevely. I'm going to give a call out to Jill Meister, who was on the board when I came onto the board, and I saw her as the board historian because she would always in board meetings, I hope Jill's out there, hey Jill, she would always in board meetings say, remember 5 years ago when we already had this conversation and we made this decision, or remember 5 years ago when, and I think there's a balance there too, because we can't just sit in the past and do the same thing that we did 5 years ago. And I don't think that was Jill's point, but I have found myself doing that more, that I've been on the board longer. And I know Bond and Misa have done that because they've been on the board longer too. And I think it's partially about perspective and just understanding the context with which a decision happened to be made so that we can take that as a learning and move forward. So the balance of being able to have some historical perspective while also keeping that open-minded, the last letter in Bonco, that open-minded, fresh perspective moving forward and allowing new voices to come in, allowing the evolution of the industry to come in, and take those two and balance them together to inform the path forward. That's helped me both at APRA as well as in my career as well. So I'm grateful for that.
Thank you so much. And again, a huge thank you to you all, Melissa, Bond, Misa, for joining us today and sharing not only your knowledge, but yourselves, because there's been a lot that APRA's gone through that you've had to tangle with over the past year, and we've come out of it for the better. And again, our future is everything we can imagine. So again, thank you everyone for participating. Thank you all for joining us on this last day of APRA VE 2021, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Cherise.
Thanks, Al. Thanks, Cherise.
Thank you.